Hello, my name is Cynthia Head, and I'm honored to present my systematic literature review as part of Trevecca Nazarene University's Education Specialist Program. My project aims to explore the strengths and shortcomings of blended learning methods, specifically focusing on secondary level students and beyond. As students progress through secondary education, their motivation to read often declines despite the increasing demand for improved reading comprehension and vocabulary skills. Emerging technologies allow educators to customize instruction, empower student choice, provide timely feedback, and introduce flexible, technology driven approaches. However, it's essential to acknowledge that not all blended learning tools have the same impact. My research questions centered around the changes in motivation observed in secondary students after the implementation of blended learning and how this impacted reading comprehension and vocabulary acquisition. As a tutor for standardized testing, I recognized that these skills were holding students back from higher scores and more scholarship opportunities. That desire to help high schoolers become college ready and gain more scholarships was the initial driving force in my research. The National Reading Panel noted in 2000 it highlights phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension as crucial components of literacy, with reading comprehension being essential across academic disciplines. However, there is a decline in core reading skills, as indicated by the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Anderson and Freebody reported a consistently strong relationship between vocabulary and academic performance. Finally, a lack of motivation is one of the defining characteristics of struggling adolescent readers. Some argue that the blended learning model can positively influence these key areas. Let's take a look at the definition of that intervention. Christensen Institute defines blended learning as offering student control over time, place, path, or pace using online learning with a portion of the learning in a traditional school setting. A combination of modalities may be part of the course, but the various elements merge to create an integrated learning environment. There are four models in most blended learning programs: rotation, flex, a la carte, and enrich virtual. The rotation model can be experienced through four different submodels. When beginning my research, I was most interested in learning more about station rotation practices to enrich my classroom instruction. I wanted to know more about how other teachers were creating instructional tools that would take into account the individual instead of a one size fits all approach. Now, regarding the criteria for inclusion and exclusion for this systematic literature review, I utilized all EBSCO databases. When limiting the search, I focused on full text, peer-reviewed academic journals published in English from 2019 or later. Sources were screened at the title level, abstract level, and finally full text, filtering studies based on criteria such as 40 participants or more, a study duration of a minimum of 4 weeks, and studies with appropriate pre and post tests. These were quantitative or mixed methods in the study design. Here is an example of one of the three search strings utilized to expand the blended learning results, but decrease the population results to include those beyond middle school. The filtering of graduate studies was done during the full text phase of screening. It was necessary for this topic that I included phrases like education and information technologies to try to cast the net as wide as possible, but still include relevant content. The sources were imported into Ryan's online software program for the abstract analysis. From this graphic, you can see the reasons for exclusions at the full text phase. So the 526 relevant results were narrowed down to 45. The 45 studies were narrowed down to the most relevant 30 studies with the strongest designs. Ryan generated a word cloud based on the records identified. It is obvious from this graphic that the research was primarily from other countries outside of the United States, and there were more studies based on student motivation than reading comprehension or vocabulary acquisition. As you can see in an upcoming slide, students studying English as a second language were common participants in the studies collected. Perhaps this could be in relation to the skills I chose with the reading comprehension and vocabulary acquisition and the older student population. I used an Excel spreadsheet to track key details from the 30 strongest studies identified, and 19 themes were analyzed. I've listed here the themes that were present in most studies. So the ones listed here had the most check marks. These themes will be presented in the next slides, but the one thing that I will note here is that the intervention naturally included a variety of instructional strategies as compared to the traditional classroom. In the control classroom, they were commonly labeled as the traditional classroom. The instructions, the instructional practices relied heavily on lectures, workbooks, worksheets, textbooks, and other in-class activities such as small group work that had been part of the normal course for years. Going back to the definition of blended learning, I was curious to find out how a student's partial control over place, pace, and path was happening in these classrooms. By virtue of the online exercise and not being constrained to the limited time in the classroom, they all had some choice in terms of place. Pace is also embedded into this approach very easily because the student can start and stop the activity, meaning in a traditional classroom, you can't ask the teacher to repeat something with the same level of ease that you can replay a video. The area that was less present was the student choice and path. This is defined by students being able to choose materials that align in a custom way with the student's abilities and interests and or interests. An example of this from the research would be a student who could read an ebook of choice instead of the entire class reading the same ebook. Some interventions included adaptive technology that would change the student's path due to different ability levels receiving questions. Some classrooms used various paths for their students, but this was noticeably less, as you can see from this graphic. 5 out of 10 of the studies used a variety of path for motivation, 6 out of 10 for reading, 6 out of 10 studies for vocabulary offered students some level of customization in that path. Analyzing the data revealed statistically significant improvements in 90% of the studies, indicating the effectiveness of blended learning approaches. When considering these outcomes, it's also important to recognize the flipped classroom was the most utilized blended learning approach. In this method, students are responsible for learning content as part of the homework, with the application of that knowledge used in the following class. Here is a quote from one of the studies in reference to the flipped classroom method of blended learning. In this quote, knowledge and comprehension, the lowest levels of Bloom's taxonomy, are taken care of in students' own time. This way, it also ensures personalization of learning as well as autonomy. Students take responsibility for their own learning at their own pace. I was very interested in recording the software used to see if there were resources that could help teachers with student motivation, reading comprehension, and vocabulary acquisition. Here I have a mix of the applications and activities named in the studies. Learning management systems were the most widely used application in the studies, with 11 of the 30 studies using it as part of the intervention. There were several built in options of activities within the LMS, such as discussion posts, quizzes, and the distribution of the content. When analyzing activities, videos were listed frequently, with that tool being used in 13 of the 30 studies. In this slide, I've listed the other programs and activities used. Some are specific to a curriculum, such as Aim High curriculum, while others were generically described. If the study was funded by a company endorsing an application, I excluded that research due to a conflict of interest. In this bar chart, you can see the likelihood of use. I didn't analyze every tool in this way, but as far as these are a mix of video, for example, what I would classify as an activity, whereas the LMS, you can see the different ones named here. That's an application. It utilizes some specific software. So in terms of application, you can see from this chart that LMS, messaging, Facebook, and Read Theory, those were, this is a comparison of the likelihood of use. But in terms of activities, videos, it stood out so much that very early on, I wanted that to be one of the activities that I tracked to see, just to illustrate how frequently that was used. In addition to the previous items presented, I saw that learner autonomy was important to the blended learning mode, and with the flipped classroom, that teachers had to find ways of holding students accountable for learning the material at home. This happened through quizzes and sometimes awarding badges for reinforcement. When analyzing themes, I noticed the lack of social media use. This seemed a little bit ironic due to the amount of time that students spend on social media. Finally, when comparing the blended learning modes, the flipped classroom structure was most commonly used, with little reference to other modes such as station rotation. As I mentioned in my earlier, station rotation was actually the thing I was most interested in, but was surprised to find how little it was discussed in these top 30 studies on this topic. As for limitations, the studies identified were primarily in college settings. Only 7 studies used secondary students as participants. A large portion of the studies were in classrooms where students are learning English in countries outside of the United States. Also, the results may speak more to the specific method of the effectiveness of the flipped classroom method and may not be as relevant to the other modes of the blended learning model. In addition, some of the studies were conducted during the middle of a pandemic, which had an obvious impact on the classroom. For my recommendations, learning management systems possess the potential to enhance student motivation, bolster reading comprehension, and facilitate vocabulary acquisition, particularly in undergraduate studies. The flipped classroom model facilitates increased instructional variety, empowering students with flexible scheduling and study locations beyond the confines of traditional classrooms. In reading some of the qualitative research, there was a clear shift of responsibility for the students to take more ownership in their learning with this approach. Moving forward, further research is needed to explore the impact of blended learning on secondary students. There is a gap in the literature regarding the various blended learning models. The search string I used was very elaborate, but the flipped classroom dominated the results. I would be curious to find out why that is the case. In regard to learning management systems, it is important to analyze the software and compare and contrast features to help teachers decide which platform will best suit their needs. In addition, it would be interesting to learn practical ways teachers can incorporate more student choice of materials and paths that are increasingly customized. In conclusion, research suggests that the flipped classroom model is effective at the collegiate level in improving students' motivation, reading comprehension, and vocabulary acquisition. More research is needed to evaluate its impact at the secondary student level. Learning management systems are commonly utilized in the blended learning method to give students some control over pace and place. However, the curriculum design rarely includes a customized approach based on the student's ability and interests. Here are some references directly um, referenced in this particular presentation. And for my systematic literature review, here are those references. Thank you for listening to this presentation on the impact of blended learning model on secondary students' motivation, reading comprehension, and vocabulary acquisition as part of Trevecca Nazarene University's Education Specialist Program. Are there any questions?